The film opens with an explanation concerning a fighter pilot weapons school. The U.S. Navy founded Top Gun in 1969, and its trainees refer to it as such. Now fast forward more than 30 years. Captain Pete Mitchell, one of the Top Gun program's greatest pilots, is in his hangar somewhere in California's Mojave Desert. He's going through images of his memories before riding his motorcycle to a military facility to demonstrate scramjet flying. His colleague informs him that Vice Admiral Chester Kane has chosen to permanently discontinue the program due to the inability to fulfill the contract barrier of Mach 10. Despite the statement, Pete is intent about proving that they can cross the line. He goes through a series of physical fitness tests in preparation for his flight and takes off in the jet just as Admiral Kane arrives at the base. Following a hard push on the jet, Pete ultimately reaches Mach 10 while being watched by Kane. Nevertheless, his vanity gets him into problems when he exceeds Mach 10, causing the plane to overheat and malfunction. Thankfully, Pete is able to evacuate himself in time and land near a diner. Pete is then led to Kane's office, where the Admiral observes that with all of his commendations throughout the years, Pete should have been a 2-star Admiral by now. Kane, on the other hand, believes that unmanned planes represent the future of the Navy's Air Force, ultimately removing all pilots, including Pete. Kane wants to permanently ground Pete, but he recently learned that the Navy wants to send Pete back to Top Gun at North Island. Pete is looking forward to seeing North Island, where the United States Pacific Fleet is stationed. He recalls his time in Top Gun with his opponent Tom Kaczynski, nicknamed Iceman, who happens to be the fleet's commander. Pete meets with Vice Admiral Simpson and Rear Admiral Solomon Bates, who brief him on the mission's objectives. After reviewing the assignment, they are forming a strike squad to knock out a uranium enrichment plant that violates a NATO treaty and is located in a difficult-to-reach region. Pete believes he has been summoned to fly as a part of the strike team, but the admirals inform him that he would instead educate 5 Top Gun grads to fly the mission. Bradley Bradshaw, one of the grads, is the son of Pete's old buddy Goose, who died when the two were flying together years ago. This increases Pete's apprehension about the assignment, and he desires to refuse it. Bo, on the other hand, informs him that Commander Kaczynski personally has requested Pete to teach, and that if he rejects, he will be retired from the Navy, unable to decline. Pete chooses to drown his sorrows in a pub when he runs across his ex-girlfriend Penny Benjamin, who is now the bar's owner. Pete's poor connections with admirals in the Navy are discussed, and Penny sounds a bell, signifying that Pete would purchase a round for everyone in the pub for breaking the establishment's rule of having his phone on the bar. He observes several of his incoming pupils entering the pub and greeting each other with their pilot monikers. Bradley, alias Rooster, arrives to join them. Jake is a hotshot who believes he is the finest pilot among them, causing conflict between him and Bradley. Pete, feeling uneasy, chooses to pay his tab and go, but when his card is denied, Penny orders Jake and Ruben to toss him out of the pub instead. From the outside, he observes Bradley and his pals playing the piano, which reminds him of old times with Bradley's father. The pilots are astonished to hear that their instructor is Pete, whom they had thrown out of the pub the night before. Pete informs them that even though they've been considered as the top pilots in the Navy and know the F-18 jet manual like the back of their hands, they should forget about it, because he's here to push them to their limits as pilots. The first activity is dogfighting, in which students work in groups to shoot down Pete's plane before being shot themselves. The students are eliminated one by one, but no one manages to kill Pete. Bradley eventually gets into a personal dogfight with Pete because they both have unresolved concerns. They engage in a Cobra maneuver, which sends them below the lower altitude restriction, putting Pete in hot water with Bo. Pete argues that, despite the mission's great risk, the pupils must be adept at dogfighting at lower altitudes in order to live. Elsewhere, Natasha chastises Bradley for his lack of concentration, but he explains that it's because he's still upset with Pete for withdrawing his Navy application papers, which put back his career by 4 years on the base. Jake discovers that Bradley's father was once acquainted with Pete. Later, Pete goes to the pub to settle his prior tab and runs across Penny's now adult daughter, Amelia. Penny intends to sail their boat to the yard with Amelia to repair the engine, but she claims she needs to prepare for her test tomorrow. Pete agrees to take her place, and the two of them sail together over choppy waters. Despite his service in the Navy, Pete has never operated a boat. He eventually drives Penny home on his motorcycle, demonstrating that they still have affection for one another. The pilots are now moving on to a separate exercise that is connected to how they would fly during the operation. They must fly below 100 feet down a narrow canyon to escape being shot down by missiles, and they must accomplish so in less than 2.5 minutes to dodge the arrival of the enemy's more sophisticated planes. When it's Bradley's turn, he appears to take a more careful approach to flying, allowing him to reach the goal, despite the fact that he is a minute late. Pete blames him for it, but Bradley contends that there are other options for completing the task besides Pete's. Jake then remarks that Bradley is trapped in the past because of his father's death, provoking Bradley to get angry with Jake until the others restrain him. Afterwards, Kaczynski texts Pete, inviting him to meet him. Pete visits his home and meets with his wife, who notifies him that his throat cancer has returned and that he is unable to talk. Pete enters Kaczynski's office, where he begins texting Pete about work on his computer. Pete begs Kaczynski not to make him choose Bradley for the mission because he believes Bradley is not ready. He is still angry with him, which causes him to be unfocused. Kaczynski says there's still time before the mission for Pete to teach Bradley, and that Pete should let go of his fear of sending Bradley away on a mission. Kaczynski says to Pete in hushed tones that he battled for Pete to stay in the Navy since Bradley and the Navy rely on him. The next day, Bo notices that no one is training at the base and finds them playing football with Pete near the shore. The pilots appear to be having a good time, but Bo approaches Pete to inquire as to why they aren't training. Pete claims that this is a component of the training, helping the pilots bond so that they can form a solid team during the mission. Later, Pete drops off Penny at her house, and he discloses why he took Bradley's paperwork from the academy. The pilots are notified in the morning that they only have 1 week before the expedition since the uranium reserves will be delivered sooner than planned. Despite the fact that none of them were successful in the last exercise, they are now moving on to Phase 2 of the exercise, which is to dive into the canyon and hit the target twice. They must next maintain a low altitude while flying practically straight out of the canyon, facing extremely tremendous gravitational pull. Nobody appears to be able to pull it off after attempting it repeatedly. Meanwhile, Natasha and Robert's jet caught fire, causing them to evacuate before the plane fell at full speed to the earth. Pete tells Bradley that his pals are fine, but Bradley questions Pete about withdrawing his paperwork. Pete claims that Bradley was not prepared, which is insufficient for Bradley, who claims that he will not repeat his father's mistake of trusting Pete. Solomon interrupts their conversation to notify Pete that Kaczynski has died. They all come to his funeral. And now that Kaczynski can no longer fill in for Pete in the Navy, Bo decides to permanently ground Pete and take over pilot training himself. As Pete gives Penny the news, she informs him that now that Kaczynski isn't there to help, he must find his own way to help prepare the team. When the pilots are being briefed on their new, less difficult but riskier plan the next morning, they are all shocked to discover Pete flying an F-18 and accomplishing the prior mission simulation in a far lower time limit thus far. He is the only one that completes the mission flawlessly, demonstrating to the younger pilots that the operation is really flyable in the aftermath. While Bo wants to honorably discharge Pete for insubordination and technically stealing a plane, he instead decides to name Pete the mission's squad commander because he is the only one who can accomplish it. He informs Penny, who is both proud and concerned about his safety. The mission day arrives, and Pete selects Natasha, Robert, Mickey, and Ruben as his Foxtrot teams. To everyone's amazement, he then picks Bradley as his runway wingman. Bradley wishes to speak with Pete, but Pete says they'll chat once they successfully complete the task. The pilots take off while their carrier launches 6 Tomahawk missiles at the enemy's airbase in order to prevent any of the enemy's planes from getting off. When the crew is flying through the canyons, the Navy radar identifies 2 enemy planes in the sky that haven't yet recognized the team's presence. The rockets, however, demolish their airbase. They instantly turn around and head for the uranium facility, and they've completed their task successfully. It's not finished yet because they must climb and allow the anti-aircraft missiles to pursue them. After Bradley's jet runs out of flares, they engage in a fierce duel to destroy the missiles. Pete rushes to his rescue as a missile approaches from behind, using his jet's flares to destroy the other missiles, but one of them strikes his plane and forces him to crash. Bradley and the other base personnel want to return to Pete's rescue, but Bo warns them not to since the enemy's aircraft are closing in. Meanwhile, Pete awakens on the ground just as an enemy chopper notices him and begins firing at him. He is almost murdered when the chopper is shot down by Bradley, who has chosen to defy his orders and return for Pete. Nevertheless, his plane gets hit by a missile, and he is forced to eject. As the two regroup, they want to sneak into the enemy's base and steal one of their F-14 Tomcats. After taking off with such a small runway, Pete instructs Bradley to contact their base using his signal emitter, which amazes the folks at their base. The two are confronted by two considerably stronger enemy planes, and finally engage in a dogfight with them. Pete shoots down one of the jets with flares and bullets, but they run out of ammunition just as the second plane approaches. As Pete and Bradley prepare to say their ultimate goodbyes, Jake blows up the hostile plane, making light of the fact that their rescuer has arrived. Everyone congratulates them on a successful mission as they return to base. Pete and Bradley reconcile their differences and become excellent friends. Penny appears to Pete's hangar when he and Bradley are repairing Pete's jet. The film concludes with the pair taking off on the plane together. And this is the end of the video. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and support us with like and suggest a movie you would like to recap it.